The dust on Faith Fletcher's boots had turned from brown to russet in the fading August light of 1883, when she rounded the corner of Main Street in Julian, California, and saw the thick iron padlock hanging from her door like a judgment. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, the metal cold despite the lingering heat of the summer day, and she tugged once, twice, knowing it was useless but unable to stop herself from trying. 3 months she had been gone, tending to her dying mother in San Francisco, and now she stood here in this gold-mining town tucked into the Cuyamaca Mountains, locked out of the only home she had left, Mrs. Fletcher. The voice came from behind her, deep and careful, and Faith turned to see Thomas Calloway standing at the base of her porch steps, his hat in his hands. She had seen him around town before her departure, the quiet cowboy who worked the cattle ranch east of town and kept to himself mostly. But they had never spoken more than polite greetings. He was tall, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water in spring, perhaps 25 or 26 years to her 23, and there was something steady about the way he looked at her now, like he was bracing himself to deliver bad news. "It's Miss Fletcher now," she said, her voice catching despite her best efforts. "My husband died 2 years ago. What happened here, Mr. Calloway? Why is my door locked?" Thomas shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. "The bank took it. Said you missed 3 mortgage payments while you were gone. I tried to tell them you'd be back, that you were tending to family matters, but they wouldn't listen. Put the lock on yesterday morning." The world tilted sideways for a moment, and Faith gripped the porch railing to steady herself. She had paid what she could before leaving, had told Mr. Henderson at the bank she would settle the rest when she returned, but her mother's illness had stretched longer than expected, eating through what little savings she had. "They cannot do this. I own this house. My husband and I built it with our own hands. They can do whatever they want when there's money owed." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, Miss Fletcher. I know it is not fair." Faith pressed her forehead against the door frame, feeling the rough wood against her skin. Inside that locked house were her clothes, her photographs, the quilt her mother had made for her wedding, the last remnants of the life she had tried so hard to build after her husband, Daniel, had been killed in a mining accident. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, not really meaning to say it aloud. "You can stay with me tonight." She turned sharply to look at him, searching his face for any hint of impropriety, but found only honest concern. "Mr. Calloway, I cannot possibly. I have a small place on the ranch," he said quickly. 2 rooms. You can have the bedroom and I will sleep in the main room by the fire. It is not much, but it is clean and safe and you will not be bothered. In the morning, we can go to the bank and sort this out properly." Every fiber of propriety screamed that she should refuse, should find some other solution. But as the sun dipped lower behind the mountains and the evening chill began to creep into the air, Faith realized she had no other options. The boarding house was full of miners, and she knew no one in town well enough to impose. Her pride warred with her desperation, and desperation won. "Just for tonight," she said finally, "and I will repay your kindness somehow." Thomas nodded and settled his hat back on his head. "My horse is tied up at the saloon. Wait here and I will bring him around." He disappeared down the street, and Faith stood alone on her porch, looking at the padlock one more time. She had been so young when she married Daniel, barely 19, full of dreams about building a life in this mountain town where gold still glittered in the streams and the air smelled of pine and possibility. 4 years later, she was a widow with empty pockets and nowhere to sleep. She blinked back tears, refusing to let them fall. Her mother had raised her to be stronger than this. Thomas returned leading a sturdy bay horse, and before Faith could protest, He had swung up into the saddle and extended his hand down to her. "It is about 2 miles out. Too far to walk in the dark." She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm as he pulled her up behind him with surprising ease. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep her balance, and she felt him stiffen slightly at the contact before relaxing. The horse moved forward at an easy walk, and they left Julian behind, following a narrow road that wound through stands of oak and pine. "I am sorry about your mother," Thomas said after a while, his voice carrying back to her over the rhythmic clop of hooves. "I heard she had taken ill." "Thank you. She passed 3 weeks ago." Faith watched the darkening landscape slide past, the mountains rising like sentinels on either side. "I should have come back sooner, should have found a way to send money for the mortgage. You were doing what needed to be done. The bank should have shown more understanding. The bank cares about money, not understanding." Thomas made a sound that might have been agreement, and they fell into silence again. Faith found herself noticing small things about him. The way he sat easy in the saddle like he had been born there, the breadth of his shoulders under his worn cotton shirt, the faint smell of leather and sage that clung to him. She pushed the thoughts away, embarrassed by her own awareness. The man was just being kind, offering help to someone in need, and here she was cataloging details about him like some foolish girl. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, a scatter of buildings silvered by moonlight. Thomas guided the horse past a large barn and several corrals full of sleeping cattle, heading toward a small cabin set apart from the main ranch house. "The foreman lives in the big house with his family," he explained. "I work the cattle and help with the horses. The pay is not much, but it comes with room and board." He dismounted and helped Faith down, his hand steady on her waist. She felt the strength in his grip and found herself wondering what it would be like to be held by those hands, really held, and the thought made heat rise in her cheeks. She was grateful for the darkness that hid her face. The cabin was indeed small, just 2 rooms connected by an open doorway, but Thomas had not lied about it being clean. A simple table and 2 chairs occupied one corner of the main room, with a pot-bellied stove against one wall and a worn but comfortable-looking chair near the fireplace. Through the doorway, she could see a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt. Everything was neat and orderly, almost Spartan in its simplicity. "I will get a fire going," Thomas said, moving to the fireplace. "Are you hungry? I have some bread and cheese and I can make coffee. Please do not go to any trouble." But even as she said it, Faith's stomach growled loudly enough for them both to hear, and Thomas smiled, a quick flash of warmth that transformed his serious face. "It is no trouble." He worked efficiently, building a fire and setting a battered coffee pot on the stove, then laying out bread, cheese, and some dried apples on the table. Faith sat in one of the chairs and watched him move around the small space, struck by how comfortable he seemed with these domestic tasks. Daniel had always expected her to handle everything related to the house and meals, had viewed it as beneath him to do such work. "Thank you," she said when Thomas set a plate in front of her. "Truly, Mr. Calloway, I do not know what I would have done tonight without your help. Call me Thomas. And you would have figured something out. You seem like someone who knows how to survive." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and sat across from her. Faith broke off a piece of bread, considering his words. "I used to think I was. These past few months have tested that belief." "Grief tests everything." Thomas stared into his coffee cup. "I lost my parents when I was 17. Cholera took them both within a week of each other. I thought the world had ended, that I would never feel solid ground under my feet again. How did you manage?" "I kept moving, kept working. Eventually, the pain dulled enough that I could breathe again." He looked up at her, his green eyes serious. "It never goes away completely, but it becomes something you can carry." They ate in companionable silence, and Faith felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. There was something calming about Thomas's presence, a quietness that did not demand anything from her. When they finished, he insisted on cleaning up while she used the bedroom to change into her nightdress, which thankfully she had packed in the small bag she had brought from San Francisco. She emerged to find him arranging blankets on the floor near the fireplace, and she felt a pang of guilt. "Thomas, that cannot be comfortable. Please take the bed and I will sleep out here." "Absolutely not." His tone left no room for argument. "You are my guest, and you have been through enough today. The floor is fine. I have slept in worse places." Faith wanted to protest further but found she was too exhausted to fight. "Good night, then, and thank you again." "Good night, Faith." She lay in the narrow bed, listening to the fire crackle and the soft sounds of Thomas settling in the other room, and wondered how her life had arrived at this strange place. 6 months ago, she had been managing, barely but managing, running a small dressmaking business from her home and keeping up with her bills. Now she was homeless, sleeping in a stranger's bed while he made do with the hard floor. The unfairness of it all pressed down on her chest, but beneath that was something else, a tiny flicker of something that might have been hope. She had been alone for so long, carrying everything by herself, and tonight someone had stepped in to shoulder part of the burden without expecting anything in return. She fell asleep thinking about green eyes and calloused hands. Morning arrived with birdsong and the smell of coffee. Faith dressed quickly in one of her traveling dresses and found Thomas already up, looking fresh despite having slept on the floor. He had laid out bread and jam for breakfast, and they ate quickly before heading back to town on his horse. Faith once again seated behind him with her arms around his waist. Julian was already bustling with activity when they arrived, miners heading to their claims, shopkeepers opening their doors, wagons rattling down the dusty streets. Thomas hitched his horse outside the bank, a solid brick building that proclaimed its permanence and authority. Faith straightened her shoulders and walked inside, Thomas following a step behind. Mr. Henderson sat behind his large oak desk, his spectacles perched on his narrow nose, and he looked up with barely concealed annoyance when Faith approached. "Miss Fletcher, I had heard you returned." "You locked my house, Mr. Henderson, without warning, without giving me a chance to make arrangements." Faith kept her voice level despite the anger churning in her stomach. "You were 3 months behind on payments. The bank cannot operate on promises and good intentions." He shuffled some papers on his desk, not meeting her eyes. "The property will be auctioned next week to recover what is owed." "How much?" Thomas asked, speaking for the first time. Henderson glanced at him with barely disguised disdain. "I do not see how that concerns you, Mr. Calloway." "How much does she owe?" the banker sighed. $65 plus fees and interest, total of $80. Faith felt the number like a physical blow. She had perhaps $15 to her name, the last of what had remained after paying for her mother's burial. $80 might as well have been $800. Thomas pulled a leather pouch from his pocket and counted out bills on the desk. $80. Clear the debt and remove the lock. "Thomas, no." Faith grabbed his arm. "I cannot let you do that. It is too much. It is done." He kept his eyes on Henderson. "Give her the receipt and the key." The banker's expression shifted from disdain to surprise to grudging respect as he gathered the money and began writing out the receipt. "Very well. The property is clear. I will have someone remove the lock this afternoon." Outside, Faith turned on Thomas, torn between gratitude and frustration. "Why would you do that? That money, it must be everything you have saved." "Not everything." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. But even if it was, it is my choice how to spend it. I will pay you back. Every cent. I do not know how yet, but I will. I am not worried about it. He untied his horse, and Faith noticed how he would not quite meet her eyes now, as if embarrassed by his own generosity. They rode back to her house in silence, and true to Henderson's word, a man was already there removing the padlock. Faith slid down from the horse before Thomas could help her, and stood looking at her door, suddenly afraid of what she might find inside. But when she pushed it open, everything was as she had left it, undisturbed except for the thin layer of dust that had settled over the furniture. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind her. I should get back to the ranch. If you need anything, will you come for dinner tonight? The words tumbled out before Faith could stop them. Please, it is the least I can do, and I make a decent pot roast. He smiled that transforming smile again. I would like that. After he left, Faith threw herself into cleaning, scrubbing away the dust and emptying her traveling bag, and trying not to think about the flutter in her stomach every time she remembered the feeling of her arms around Thomas's waist. It was too soon, too impractical. She barely knew the man, and she was in no position to be entertaining romantic notions about anyone. But as she prepared dinner that evening, choosing her best dress and pinning her dark hair up carefully, she could not deny the anticipation that hummed through her veins. Thomas arrived exactly at sunset, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt, his hair still damp and combed back from his face. He had brought wildflowers, a simple bouquet of black-eyed Susans and purple asters, and he handed them to her with an awkwardness that made her heart squeeze. I saw them growing on the ride over, thought they might brighten the place. They are beautiful, thank you. Faith arranged them in a mason jar while Thomas stood in her small parlor, looking endearingly uncertain about where to put himself. Sit, please, dinner will be ready in just a moment. The pot roast was good, if she said so herself, tender and savory with carrots and potatoes, and they ate at her small kitchen table with the lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. Thomas told her about the ranch, about the foreman's 3 children who followed him around begging for rides on the horses, about the mountain lion he had spotted last week watching the cattle from a distant ridge. Faith found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. What will you do now? Thomas asked as they finished eating. With the house, I mean. Will you stay in Julian? I do not know. Faith traced the rim of her water glass with one finger. I had a small dressmaking business before I left, but I lost most of my customers while I was gone. I need to find work, but there is not much in this town for a woman on her own. You could make clothes for the ranch families. The foreman's wife is always complaining about how hard it is to get decent dresses out here. And there are several other ranches in the area that might need your services. It was a good idea, practical and achievable. I could do that, if you would introduce me, of course. They lingered over coffee, talking about everything and nothing, and Faith realized with a start that it was fully dark outside, that hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Thomas seemed to notice at the same time and stood reluctantly. I should go. It is a long ride back. Faith walked him to the door, suddenly desperate for him to stay, for this evening not to end. Thomas, she stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. He turned to face her, standing close in the doorway, and the air between them felt charged with possibility. Yes. Thank you for everything. For helping me when you had no reason to. I had a reason. His voice was low, intense. I have been watching you since before you left for San Francisco, Faith. I know that is forward of me to say, but I am not good at pretending. When I saw you standing on your porch yesterday looking so lost, all I wanted was to fix it for you, to make things right again. Faith's breath caught in her throat. You have been watching me. Not in a strange way, just I noticed you. The way you walked through town with your head up even after your husband died. The way you smiled at everyone even when I could tell you were tired. I wanted to talk to you, but I could never find the courage, and then you were gone." She reached out and touched his chest, feeling his heart beating fast beneath her palm. "I noticed you too. I thought you were the most attractive man I had ever seen, and that made me feel guilty because I was supposed to still be mourning Daniel. It has been 2 years. You are allowed to live again." "Am I?" The question came out as a whisper. Instead of answering, Thomas cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, soft and questioning, giving her every chance to pull away. But Faith did not pull away. She leaned into him, kissing him back with 2 years of loneliness and longing pouring out of her. His arms came around her waist, pulling her close, and she wound her fingers into his hair, reveling in the solid warmth of him, the rightness of being held like this. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I should definitely go now before I forget myself entirely." "What if I do not want you to go?" The boldness of her own words shocked her, but she did not take them back. "Faith, I will not take advantage. You would not be taking advantage, I am asking." She pulled back enough to look into his eyes. "Stay with me, please." The conflict played across his face, desire warring with honor, but desire won. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and she led him toward the bedroom, both of them fumbling with buttons and laces, laughing breathlessly at their own eagerness. They came together in the darkness with a tenderness that made Faith's eyes sting with tears, and afterward, she lay in Thomas's arms listening to his heartbeat and feeling like she had finally come home. In the weeks that followed, Faith rebuilt her life with Thomas as her anchor. True to his word, he introduced her to the ranch families, and soon she had more sewing work than she could handle. She made dresses for the foreman's wife and shirts for the ranch hands, mended torn trousers and let out waistbands. Word spread, and other ranches began sending work her way. The money was not much, but combined with what she made selling vegetables from her small garden, it was enough to get by. Thomas rode into town every evening after his work was done, sharing dinner with her and staying long into the night. They talked about everything, their childhoods and their dreams and their fears, learning each other with the intensity of people who had both been alone too long. He told her about his plan to save enough money to buy his own ranch someday, a small spread where he could raise horses. She told him about her secret dream of opening a dress shop, a real store on Main Street where women could come and choose from bolts of fabric and pattern books. On Sundays, they rode out into the mountains together, exploring the trails that wound through the pine forests and meadows. Thomas taught her to shoot his rifle, standing behind her with his arms around hers, guiding her aim. She taught him to waltz in her tiny parlor, humming the tune since she had no piano, laughing when he stepped on her toes. They were falling in love, deep and completely, and everyone in town could see it. Mrs. Chen, who ran the general store, smiled knowingly when Thomas came in to buy sugar and coffee to take to Faith's house. The postmaster made comments about seeing Thomas's horse tied up outside her place at all hours. Faith knew she should care about the gossip, about what people might think, but she found she could not bring herself to worry. She had spent too many years being proper, following all the rules, and where had it gotten her? Alone and struggling. Thomas made her happy, made her feel alive again, and that was worth more than any amount of social approval. 3 months after the night she had come home to find her door locked, Thomas asked her to marry him. They were sitting on her back porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, and he simply turned to her and said, "I want to spend every evening like this for the rest of my life." "Will you marry me, Faith?" She did not hesitate. Yes, absolutely yes. They were married in the small church at the center of Julian on a crisp October morning, with the foreman and his wife serving as witnesses and half the town crowding into the pews. Faith wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored silk. She had splurged on from Mrs. Chen's store. And Thomas wore a new suit that made him look handsome and slightly uncomfortable. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Thomas kissed her in front of everyone, Faith felt a joy so complete it was almost painful. Thomas moved into her house, which became their house, and Faith sold his few belongings from the ranch cabin. He continued working at the ranch while she built up her dressmaking business, and slowly, carefully, they began to save. Every spare dollar went into a tin box they kept hidden under a floorboard, their future accumulating penny by penny. Life settled into a rhythm that was both comfortable and exciting. Faith loved waking up next to Thomas every morning, loved the way he kissed her before leaving for the ranch, and the way he pulled her into his arms as soon as he came home each evening. She loved learning all the small details of living with someone, how he took his coffee black and strong, how he sang old cowboy songs while he bathed, how he always hung his hat on the same peg by the door. In the spring, Faith realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but waited to be sure before telling Thomas, and when she finally did, sitting across from him at the dinner table, his face transformed with wonder. "A baby, we are having a baby. Yes, in late autumn, I think." He was around the table in an instant, pulling her to her feet and spinning her carefully, his laughter filling the small house. "Faith, you are incredible. This is incredible." The pregnancy was easier than she had feared, and Thomas was attentive to the point of being comical, insisting she rest constantly and practically wrapping her in cotton wool. She kept working on her sewing as long as she could, and Thomas continued to save every penny, talking excitedly about the ranch they would buy, the life they would build for their child. Their son was born on a cold November night with the foreman's wife serving as midwife. It was a long labor, painful and exhausting, but when Faith finally held the red-faced, squalling infant against her chest, she thought her heart might burst. Thomas sat beside the bed, tears streaming down his face, and touched the baby's tiny fist with one calloused finger. "He is perfect. You are perfect. I love you both so much." They named him Timothy, and he was a good baby, quick to smile and easy to soothe. Faith fashioned a sling so she could carry him while she worked on her sewing, and Thomas would come home each evening and immediately take the baby, talking to him in a low, gentle voice about the horses and cattle, about the mountains and the sky, about everything and nothing. Money was tighter with another mouth to feed, but they managed. Faith took on extra sewing work, staying up late by lamplight to finish orders while Timothy slept in a cradle Thomas had built with his own hands. Thomas picked up occasional work breaking horses for other ranches, earning extra money that went straight into their savings tin. When Timothy was 6 months old, the foreman pulled Thomas aside and told him the ranch owner was thinking of selling. The spread was not large, just 80 acres with a small house and barn, but it had good grazing land and access to water. The price was $1,500. Thomas came home that night with fire in his eyes, and he and Faith counted their savings. They had $400. It was not enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start. "We can do this," Thomas said, pacing the small parlor. "I know we can. I will talk to the bank about a loan, and with your sewing income and what I make, we can handle the payments." But the bank refused. Mr. Henderson looked at their modest savings and shook his head, saying it was not enough collateral, that the risk was too great. Thomas argued, presented figures and plans, but Henderson was unmoved. They left the bank in defeat, And that evening Thomas sat with his head in his hands, looking more discouraged than Faith had ever seen him. "We will find another way," she said, kneeling beside his chair and taking his hands in hers. "Maybe a different ranch will come available. Maybe we can save more. I wanted to give you and Timothy a real home, a place that is ours where we can build something lasting." "Thomas, look at me." She waited until he met her eyes. "I already have a real home. Wherever you are is home. The ranch will happen when it is meant to happen." He pulled her into his lap, holding her and Timothy both, and they sat like that for a long time, the three of them wrapped together in the lamplight. 2 years passed. Timothy grew into a bright, active toddler who followed his father everywhere when Thomas was home, chattering in his developing vocabulary about horses and cows. Faith's business continued to grow, and she hired Mrs. Chen's daughter to help with the simpler sewing projects. Thomas was promoted to head wrangler at the ranch, which came with a modest increase in pay. They saved and saved, adding to the tin box under the floorboard, watching their dream grow slowly closer. Then, in the summer of 1887, fate intervened in an unexpected way. Mrs. Harper, the wealthy widow who owned the large ranch north of town, came into Faith's house for a dress fitting. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, and she had exacting standards. Faith had made several dresses for her over the years, and Mrs. Harper always paid well but never seemed entirely satisfied. This time, however, as Faith pinned the hem of a burgundy silk gown, Mrs. Harper was actually smiling. "You do excellent work, Mrs. Calloway, better than anything I could get in San Francisco." "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. That is very kind of you to say. I hear your husband is quite the horseman. My foreman speaks highly of him." Faith glanced up in surprise. She had not realized Mrs. Harper paid attention to such things. "Thomas is very skilled with horses, yes. He has a gift for it." "I also hear you have been trying to buy a ranch of your own." Faith's hands stilled on the fabric. "We have been saving toward that goal, yes." Mrs. Harper was quiet for a moment, studying her reflection in the mirror. "I am getting old, Mrs. Calloway. My children have all moved back east and have no interest in ranching. I need someone to help manage my property, someone I can trust. What would you say if I offered your husband a position as my ranch manager, with a substantial increase in salary and a house on the property?" Faith's heart began to race. "I would say that is a very generous offer, Mrs. Harper, but Thomas dreams of owning his own land, not managing someone else's." "I suspected as much." Mrs. Harper turned to face Faith directly. "What if I offered him a path to ownership? He manages my ranch for 5 years, proves himself capable, and at the end of that time, I sell him 200 acres of my land at a very favorable price, with his salary going toward the purchase. By the time I die, the ranch would be his, and he would have earned it fairly." Faith could barely breathe. "Why would you do this?" "Because I am tired of seeing good people struggle when I have more than I need. Because your work has brought me joy, and I would like to repay that. Because I need someone I can trust to care for my land, and I believe your husband is that person." Mrs. Harper smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her usual stern expression. "Also because I am a sentimental old fool who believes young love should be rewarded." That evening, when Faith told Thomas about the offer, he was speechless. They talked late into the night, weighing the pros and cons, discussing every angle. 5 years was a long time, but at the end of it, they would have a real ranch, 200 acres of their own. It was more than they had dared to dream. Thomas accepted the position the next day. They moved to Mrs. Harper's ranch that autumn, into a sturdy 4-room house with a real bedroom for Timothy and space for Faith to set up a proper sewing room. Thomas threw himself into the work with passionate dedication, rising before dawn and working until dark, learning every aspect of ranch management. Mrs. Harper was a demanding boss but fair, and she taught Thomas everything she knew about breeding cattle and managing land and negotiating prices. Faith continued her dressmaking, now serving the wives of all the ranchers in the area, and her reputation grew. She hired 2 more assistants and began taking orders from as far away as San Diego. The money was good, better than she had ever imagined, and it all went toward their future. In the spring of 1889, Faith gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Florence. She had her father's green eyes and her mother's dark hair, and Timothy was utterly enchanted with his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Their family felt complete, and Faith often found herself pausing in the middle of her busy days to simply marvel at how far they had come. Mrs. Harper proved to be not just an employer but a friend. She doted on the children, often inviting them to her main house for cookies and stories. She taught Faith about managing household accounts and investing money wisely. She told Thomas stories about the early days of the cattle industry, sharing knowledge that could not be found in any book. The 5 years of their agreement began to feel less like a waiting period and more like an apprenticeship, a gift of time to learn and grow and prepare. True to her word, when the 5 years ended in 1892, Mrs. Harper sold Thomas 200 acres of prime grazing land along with the house they had been living in, at a price so favorable it was almost a gift. The remaining amount they owed was manageable, easily covered by their combined incomes. They signed the papers in Mrs. Harper's parlor, and when it was done, Thomas held the deed in his hands with something like reverence. "It is real. We actually own this." "You earned it," Mrs. Harper said firmly. "Every acre. You have been the best manager I could have hoped for, and I sleep easier knowing this land is in your hands." That night, Faith and Thomas walked their property line by moonlight, holding hands like young lovers, while the children slept peacefully in the house that was now truly theirs. "Do you remember when you found me locked out of my house?" Faith asked, leaning her head on Thomas's shoulder. "I thought my life was over. I had lost everything, and I could not see any way forward. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, even with dust on your face and despair in your eyes." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her, cupping her cheek in his hand. "I remember wanting to protect you, to fix everything for you, even though I barely knew you. You saved me that night. You gave me somewhere safe to land. We saved each other." He kissed her, soft and lingering. "You gave me a reason to want more, to dream bigger. Before you, I was just drifting. After you, I had a purpose." The years that followed were full and good. Timothy grew into a strong, capable boy who loved working alongside his father, learning to ride and rope and care for the cattle. Florence was bright and fearless, climbing trees and catching lizards, and demanding to know why she could not do everything her brother did. Faith's dress shop, which she finally opened on Main Street in Julian when Florence started school, became the most successful business of its kind in the mountain towns. Thomas expanded their herd and began breeding horses on the side, developing a reputation for quality that brought buyers from across California. They faced challenges, of course. There were hard winters when they lost cattle to cold and hunger. There were droughts that dried up the streams and turned the grass brown. There were illnesses and injuries, money troubles and disagreements, all the usual trials of life. But they faced everything together, Faith and Thomas, partners in every sense of the word. Mrs. Harper passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1895, leaving her remaining land to her children, but a substantial sum of money to Faith and Thomas, in recognition of their friendship. They used it to pay off their land completely, to expand the ranch, to fund Florence's education when she expressed an interest in becoming a teacher. They named their third child, a son born in 1896, Harper in her honor. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Faith back to Julian, to the house where they had first met, where he had found her locked out and lost. It had been sold years ago to a young mining engineer and his wife, but Thomas stopped the horse in front of it anyway. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Saying yes to staying with me that night. Everything that came after." Faith looked at the house, remembering the desperation and fear she had felt standing on that porch. Then she looked at her husband, at the lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, at the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, at the hands that still made her heart race when they touched her. "Not for one single second. That night was the beginning of my real life. Everything before it was just waiting." He smiled and took her hand, kissing her knuckles. "I love you, Faith Calloway. I have loved you since the moment I saw you, and I will love you until I draw my last breath. And I love you, Thomas Calloway. You were my salvation when I needed it most, and you have been my joy every day since." They rode home together through the mountains they had both come to love, toward the ranch they had built together, toward the children waiting for them, toward the life they had fought for and won. The setting sun painted everything gold, and Faith thought about chance and choice, about locked doors and open hearts, about how sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best outcomes. She had lost so much that terrible August day in 1883, standing alone and desperate in front of her locked house. But she had gained everything that mattered in the moments that followed, when a quiet cowboy with green eyes had offered her shelter and, unknowingly, had offered her a future. The ranch prospered over the following years. Timothy grew into a man who shared his father's skill with horses and his mother's business sense. And when he was 22, he married the schoolteacher from town, a practical young woman named Sarah who fit into their family like she had always been there. Florence finished her education and returned to Julian to teach at the schoolhouse, boarding during the week in town but spending every weekend at the ranch, filling the house with her laughter and her endless questions about everything. Harper, who everyone agreed had inherited the best qualities of both his parents, showed an early talent for drawing and spent hours sketching the mountains and horses and anything else that caught his artistic eye. Faith's dress shop continued to thrive, and she eventually turned over much of the daily operations to her assistants, spending her time designing custom pieces for wealthy clients in San Francisco and San Diego who traveled to Julian specifically to commission her work. Thomas bred horses that were sought after throughout Southern California, and ranchers came from hundreds of miles away to buy his stock. They had become, by small town standards, quite successful, but they never forgot the struggle of those early years, the fear and uncertainty that had driven them forward. In 1902, Faith and Thomas celebrated their 20th anniversary with a party at the ranch that seemed to include everyone they had ever known. Tables laden with food stretched across the yard, children ran shrieking between the legs of adults, music from a hired band drifted across the property. Faith stood on the porch watching it all, feeling the weight of 2 decades of memories, when Thomas appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of punch. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Calloway." "Happy anniversary, Mr. Calloway." She clinked her glass against his and took a sip, then leaned against his solid warmth. "Did you ever imagine we would have all this? Honestly? No. When I invited you to stay with me that night, I was just hoping you would let me see you again. I had no idea we would end up here, with this life, these people we love." Faith watched Timothy swinging his wife around to the music while Florence tried to teach Harper some complicated dance step. I used to be so angry about losing my first house, about the bank locking me out. I felt like the world had been so unfair to me. Now I look back and think that losing that house was the best thing that ever happened to me. It brought me to you. The universe works in mysterious ways. Thomas set down his glass and pulled Faith into his arms, swaying to the music even though they were far from the makeshift dance floor. Every hardship, every loss, every moment of suffering led us here. I would go through it all again in a heartbeat if I knew it ended with you. She kissed him there on the porch in front of everyone, not caring who saw or what they thought. After 20 years of marriage, they had earned the right to their public affection, to their obvious devotion. When they finally pulled apart, Faith saw their children watching them with expressions of amused tolerance and deep affection, saw the party guests smiling indulgently, and she felt a rush of gratitude so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. This was what she had built from the ashes of her losses. This family, this home, this community, this love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. Thomas had offered her shelter that desperate August evening, but he had given her so much more than just a place to sleep. He had given her hope, partnership, passion, and purpose. He had given her a reason to fight, to dream, to believe in happy endings. The evening wore on, the music played, the stars came out one by one over the Cuyamaca Mountains. Faith and Thomas danced and laughed and talked with their guests, and when everyone finally went home and the children retreated to their rooms, they sat together on the porch swing, wrapped in a shared blanket against the cool night air. What do you think the next 20 years will bring? Faith asked, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder. More of this, I hope. More family, more laughter, more quiet evenings watching the sunset. Maybe some grandchildren to spoil, Faith laughed. Timothy and Sarah have only been married a year. Give them time. Florence will probably make us wait even longer. She is too busy reforming the school system to think about marriage. And Harper will end up married to his art, most likely. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only comes after years of knowing someone completely. Finally, Thomas spoke again, his voice soft in the darkness. Thank you, Faith. For what? For taking a chance on a cowboy who could barely string 2 words together. For building this life with me. For loving me even when I was difficult or distracted or worried about money. For being my partner in everything. He tightened his arm around her. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I do not tell you that often enough. Faith felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind that come from being overwhelmed with emotion. You tell me every day in 100 different ways. In the coffee you make me every morning, in the way you still kiss me goodbye before leaving for work, in how you talk about me to others when you think I am not listening. I know how you feel, Thomas. I have always known. I want to make sure you never doubt it. I never have. Not for one single moment. They stayed on the porch until the moon rose high above the mountains, talking about their memories and their hopes, about the twists and turns that had brought them together, about the life they had created against all odds. When they finally went inside, Faith took one last look at the ranch spread out before her in the moonlight, at the home they had built together from determination and love, and she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had guided her to that locked door in Julian so many years ago. Because that locked door had led to an open heart, and that open heart had given her everything she had ever wanted, and so much more than she had ever dreamed possible. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. Timothy and Sarah welcomed their first child, a son they named Daniel after Faith's first husband, and Faith was touched by their thoughtfulness in honoring that part of her history. Florence eventually did fall in love with a visiting professor from San Francisco who shared her passion for education and reform, and their wedding was a grand affair that brought tears to Thomas's eyes. Harper left for San Francisco to study art formally, and though Faith missed him terribly, she was proud of his courage in pursuing his dreams. Thomas and Faith grew older together gracefully, their hair silvering, their faces lining, their bodies slowing just a little. But the love between them never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something rich and complex and absolutely essential. They were still reaching for each other in the night, still finding excuses to touch as they passed in the house, still catching each other's eyes across crowded rooms and sharing secret smiles. In 1905, on a warm spring morning, Faith was working in her garden when she felt a sharp pain in her chest. She sat down heavily on the bench Thomas had built for her years ago, trying to catch her breath. The pain passed after a moment, but it left her shaken. She told Thomas about it that evening, and though he wanted to ride immediately for the doctor, she convinced him to wait, saying it was probably nothing. But it happened again, and then again, and finally Thomas insisted on bringing the doctor to the ranch. The diagnosis was her heart, weakening with age, something that could not be fixed but could be managed with rest and care. Faith was 51 years old, and the news felt like a betrayal by her own body. Thomas became even more protective, if that was possible, insisting she stop working entirely, doing everything himself or hiring people to help. Faith chafed against the restrictions at first but eventually accepted them, recognizing them for what they were, expressions of love and fear from a man who could not bear the thought of losing her. They had 4 more years together, 4 years of quiet mornings and easy conversations, of visits from children and grandchildren, of watching sunsets from their porch and remembering the journey they had taken together. Faith's health slowly declined, the episodes becoming more frequent, but she bore it all with grace, refusing to let it diminish her joy in the life she had built. On a cool October evening in 1909, Faith felt the pain return, sharper than ever before. She was sitting on the porch with Thomas, wrapped in quilts, watching the sky turn purple and gold. She reached for his hand and he took it immediately, his grip strong and steady. "Thomas, I need you to listen to me." Something in her voice made him turn to her with alarm. "Faith, what is wrong?" "Should I get the doctor?" "No, my love, just listen." She took a slow breath, fighting through the pain. "I have had the most extraordinary life, far beyond anything I could have imagined when I was young. And it is all because of you, because of your kindness and your love and your willingness to take a chance on a lost woman standing outside a locked house. Faith, do not talk like this. You are scaring me." "I am not afraid." And she realized it was true. "I am grateful. For every moment, every kiss, every argument, every triumph, every struggle. For our children and grandchildren. For this ranch and this life. For you most of all." The pain was growing, radiating through her chest, but she forced herself to continue. "Promise me you will remember that we had a love worth living for, that our story was beautiful." "It is beautiful, is not was. We still have years ahead of us." "Maybe." Faith smiled at him, this man who had been her salvation and her joy. "But if we do not, I want you to know that I would not change a single thing. That locked door, that terrible night, it was all worth it because it brought me to you. I love you, Faith. I love you so much. And I love you, Thomas Calloway, forever." The pain crested like a wave, and Faith's last conscious thought was of that first evening in Thomas's cabin, of the safety she had felt in his presence, of the seed of love that had been planted that night, and had grown into something magnificent. Her eyes closed, and Thomas's voice calling her name grew distant. And then there was only peace. Thomas buried Faith on a hill overlooking the ranch, under an oak tree where they had often sat together, watching the cattle graze. He had a simple headstone made with her name and the dates of her birth and death, and below that, the words she was loved. Timothy, Florence, and Harper came to stay with him in the weeks after, worried about leaving him alone, but eventually they had to return to their own lives, making him promise to send for them if he needed anything. Thomas continued running the ranch, finding solace in the work and in the memories that filled every corner of the property. He talked to Faith as he went about his days, telling her about the new foals or the weather or the funny thing Harper's latest letter had said. He kept the house exactly as she had left it, her sewing supplies still arranged in her workroom, her dresses still hanging in the closet, her hairbrush still on the dresser. He lived for 7 more years, healthy and active despite his age, and in that time he saw Timothy's family grow to include 3 more grandchildren, saw Florence publish a book on educational reform that was praised throughout California, saw Harper's paintings begin to sell in galleries in San Francisco and even New York. He took pride in all of it, in the legacy he and Faith had created together. In the spring of 1916, Thomas was found by Timothy sitting peacefully in his chair on the porch, his eyes closed and a slight smile on his face. The doctor said his heart had simply stopped, that he had gone peacefully in his sleep. He was 63 years old, and he had lived a full and meaningful life. They buried him next to Faith under the oak tree, and at the funeral, attended by what seemed like half of San Diego County, Timothy stood up to speak about his parents. He told the story of how they had met, of the locked door and the cowboy's offer of shelter, of the love that had grown from that chance encounter. He spoke of their partnership, their devotion, their unwavering commitment to each other and to their family. "My father once told me," Timothy said, his voice thick with emotion, "that the best decision he ever made was offering to help a woman he barely knew. And my mother told me that the best decision she ever made was trusting a stranger's kindness." They built an incredible life from those 2 simple choices, and they loved each other with a depth and constancy that was almost miraculous to witness. We should all be so lucky to find what they found. As the mourners dispersed and the family stood by the graves, Florence picked a handful of wildflowers and laid them on both headstones. "Do you think they knew?" she asked her brothers. "How special what they had was?" "I think they knew," Harper said softly. "I think they knew every single day." The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passed down from Timothy to his children and their children after them. The story of Faith and Thomas became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations, a reminder of where they had all come from, of the love that had built the foundation for everything that followed. And sometimes, on cool October evenings when the sky turned purple and gold, ranch hands swore they could see 2 figures sitting on the porch of the old house, hand in hand, watching the sunset together just as they had done for so many years. Whether it was true or just wishful thinking, no one could say for certain. But the story persisted, passed down through the years like a blessing, a promise that some loves are strong enough to transcend even death, that some bonds are woven so tightly they can never truly be broken. Faith and Thomas had found each other against all odds, had built a life and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And in the end, that was all anyone could really hope for, to be loved deeply and to love completely, to face both triumph and tragedy side by side with someone who made every moment worth living. They had taken a moment of crisis, a locked door and a desperate woman, and transformed it into a love story for the ages. Proof that sometimes the worst days can lead to the most beautiful beginnings.